afternoon. My name is Missy McCormick. I am Senior Director of People Strategy here at the Select Group. In recognition of Native American Heritage Month, we have guest speaker Teryn Brewington joining us today for a discussion on forgetting what you know about American Indians. Teryn has dedicated her time to Native populations while tying it to the DEI program at Blue Cross Blue Shield here locally in North Carolina. Our goal of this session is to build education around the Native community and address our own biases so we can be more aware of how we treat and interact with others. I will be monitoring the chat during this call, so drop any comments or questions that you have or feel free to speak up. But welcome, Teryn. I will pass it to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. I'll just introduce myself a little bit before I jump in. So yeah, my name is Teryn Brewington. I'm a member of the Sappony Tribe, which is one of the tribes here in North Carolina. I have an MSW from UNC Chapel Hill, but currently I work at Blue Cross Blue Shield, like Missy mentioned. I serve as their Tribal Liaison for Healthy Blue, which is our new Medicaid prepaid health plan. And I do have some background in advocating for inclusivity of Native populations in K12 curriculum. I've done presentations for elementary school, middle school, high school, college. So that's kind of where my expertise lies, and being part of a Native community too. This is just things that I've learned over the years or have been taught. And I do like to just share and educate others any time of the year, not just November too. So just to run through a brief agenda of what I'll be talking about, I'd like to talk about tribes nationally, because I know, Missy, you mentioned that you have employees who are from all across the country, so I don't want to spend too much time in North Carolina, so I'll just talk about it generally. Then I'll jump into some implicit bias and stereotypes, and then kind of wrap it up with ways that you all can partner effectively or work with tribal members or tribal populations. So first, I like to start with terminology because I get this question a lot because there's many different terms that you might hear. So in North Carolina specifically, we use the term American Indian. That's kind of the accepted term here. We have our own branch of government basically here. It's called the North Carolina Commission of Indian Affairs, and this is the term that they have adopted, and it's in a lot of North Carolina legislation. So that's why we use that term. But it varies. It varies person to person, tribe to tribe, region to region. You might have somebody who prefers Native American to American Indian. I just like to be consistent, so that's why I used American Indian. But you might hear Native people, the First Peoples, First Nations, Indigenous, all those different terms. But it really is best practice just to ask an American Indian person how they prefer to be referred to, and usually people say their tribe first. So like when I introduce myself, I'm Teryn and I'm Sappony. I don't usually say like I'm Teryn and I'm Native American. I say my tribe first, and that's usually how people identify. So just the basics, there's over 600 tribal nations in the United States, and there's a lot of diversity between them, within them. Our cultures, language, beliefs, how we look, how we dress, all of that is really, really diverse. So you can't really put like a blanket stereotype on Native people. Also, we're not just part of history. And I'll talk about that a little more in depth later about why there's this preconceived notion that we're just stuck in the past, right? Or we don't exist anymore. But we're alive and thriving, working alongside everyone else in the society. And each tribe has their own laws, policies, constitutions, ordinances, governments, and they're what we call sovereign nations. And again, I'll talk more about that later, but that means we have the inherent authority to govern ourselves. And I'll tell you why that's important in a little bit. And then there's differences in recognition status. And recognition status is there's federally recognized or there's state recognized tribes. And I will use North Carolina just as an example of this. So in North Carolina, we have 8 tribes, and one of those is what we call federally recognized. That means that the United States government recognizes that tribe as a separate and equal government. They have a government to government relationship with the United States. And then within our state, we have 7 state recognized tribes. And that means these tribes have a government to government relationship with the state of North Carolina. So that's just kind of like the differences in recognition. One is granted by the United States and one is given by the state governments. All right, so I did want to talk a little bit about colonization and what the United States looked like before colonization, or before it was even the United States, and then kind of throughout time. So this is a map, a general map of linguistic groups prior to colonization, and you can see there's lots of diversity, lots of different groups in here, and then you can break it down even further, and within those linguistic groups are different tribes, so even more diversity within these linguistic groups. And then if you look at the map on the right, this is about the early 1700s, and the white area is showing what areas and what tribes have already been either assimilated, colonized, forced to move by the early 1700s. And you can see that the East Coast has already been colonized at this point. So that's why you find a lot of differences between tribes on the East Coast and tribes on the West Coast. We had hundreds more years of colonization, assimilation, historical trauma than a lot of the tribes on the West Coast. And so as you move through time, early 1800s here on the left, and then down below that, further into the 1800s, we lose more and more land until we end up with the top right image here. And so it really does make a difference in seeing this visually and understanding how big the Native population was and how diverse it was before colonization and what we have today. So are there any questions that you want me to answer now, Missy, or do you want me to keep moving through the slides?
Does anyone have any questions right now? I haven't seen any pop up in the chat. Yeah, I think we're good.
All right. So I wanted to talk about implicit bias. And so just to kind of define implicit bias, that's our attitudes towards people, or the stereotypes that we associate with people without us consciously knowing. And this implicit bias is kind of what leads to our stereotypical views of certain people. And it's the associations our brain automatically makes about Native people. And this is a lot of times controlled by or formed by curricula, so what we learn in schools, as well as the media. So I want to kind of break those two down to understand where they come from and why a lot of people have these like stereotypes and implicit biases today and how that affects us. So first, the curriculum, what you learn in K through 12. There was a researcher, Dr. Sarah Shear, and she did a study of K through 12 curriculum in every state. And she coded it all, broke it down, and wanted to know what were children learning about American Indian populations. And what she found is that 50% of all states do not name individual American Indian people or specific tribes. 87% of references to Native people portray them prior to 1900 with no indication of what happens after 1900. 90% of everything written about Native people is written by non-Native writers, and then all states lacked content about current Native events or challenges. So what does this do? What does that mean? So basically that's what we call a whitewashing of history, right? It's a focus on the Euro-American story and the story of colonization. So this leads to students graduating thinking Native people do not exist, like they're extinct, that they are not relevant to them and their society. They aren't taught the true story of colonization. They aren't taught about genocide. And it's letting non-Native people dictate what should be a Native story, right? We should be able to tell our own story as Native people, but that is not what's happening. Non-Native people are essentially controlling that narrative. So that's basically the basis of how that implicit bias starts to form even as early as kindergarten.
Hey, Teryn, we had a question from Varda. Can you reference the name of the researcher?
Sure. If you look down, can you see the citation down at the bottom?
Not on our.
Oh, it's showing on my screen. Yes, her name is Sarah Shear, SHEAR, and her research was done in 2015, and it's called Manifesting Destiny: Representations of Indigenous People in K-12 U.S. History Standards.
Thank you. Oh, I see it now. And I dropped her website. I think this is her into the chat. So it looks like she's got other stuff. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem.
Thank you.
All right. And I think this quote is really speaks to this. So this kind of curriculum and these misconceptions have led to the invisibilization of Native people, right? So literally making Indigenous people invisible. What we teach acts as a mirror to what we value and what we recognize as legitimate. So if Native people are not viewed as legitimate, obviously they are not being taught then in schools. And these standards are perpetuating a misconception and are continuing to marginalize groups of people and minimize the concerns or issues those people have about being full citizens of the American democracy. This also leads to a phenomenon called the research asterisk, like the little star that a lot of research has when there's a population that they deem as not significant enough to include in data, right? Will be in the other category, or we'll have a little note down here that literally says not significant enough to be included in this data. And so if we aren't included in important data about whether it be health disparities, homelessness, anything like that, if we're not included, then people are not understanding what the issues are. They're not seeing those issues, and then there's not solutions presented for those issues. So it's a huge gap, a huge problem in research. So another thing that is taught in K through 12 is this Columbus as discoverer myth. And what this is literally teaching kids is whose voices to listen to and whose to ignore. So what do I mean by that? So the rhetoric around Columbus is that he solely was responsible for discovering this continent, right? A continent that was already inhabited, already had very diverse societies, thriving societies. So at that point, then the Indigenous people who were already on this continent, their existence is ignored. Their societies are ignored. They're deemed as unimportant, right? If Columbus is the one who is solely responsible for discovering this land. And this changes and enforces the power dynamic, and it places the power in the hands of the colonizer, who then control that further through what's taught in schools. Okay, so what is the harm of Columbus then? A lot of people view it as harmless, but there really is some messages that it's sending. So it portrays Indigenous people as without thought or feeling. It encourages disregard of perspectives and lives of people of color. It implicitly tells children that it's acceptable for one group of civilized, or what others deem as civilized people, to claim and control non-white others. And when this is repeated in textbooks or history lessons, it literally becomes propaganda, right? It's maintaining the status quo, and it's a historical distortion. All right, so one other phenomenon that happens a lot in K through 12 curricula, I alluded to it earlier in the research statistics, saying that 87% of references to Native people only mention them prior to 1900. It's this phenomenon of ignoring modern day Native people. So this quote by Deloya, he's a Native author. He says, the tragedy of America's Indians, that is the Indians that America loves and loves to read about, is that they no longer exist except in the pages of books. Rather, modern Indians dress much the same as any other person, attend pretty much the same schools, work at many of the same jobs, and suffer racial discrimination in the same manner as do other minorities. So basically, modern day natives are boring, right? People want the feathers, they want the beads, they want the long black braids. That's entertaining to them. That's what they want to see. That's what they think Native people look like. And when when I do presentations, or when I get requests for presentations, a lot of times for schools, teachers ask for the feathers, the beads, the dancing. That's all they want. They don't actually want to like learn how to engage with Native populations or teach them current relevant information. They are asking us to kind of contribute to perpetuating the stereotype, right? And so they do get kind of disappointed, I feel like, when I show up at a presentation and I'm dressed like this and I have my iPhone, and the kids kind of are like, whoa, like, I didn't realize that Native people look like this. And it incorrectly teaches children that real Indians no longer exist, right? I'm not a real Indian because I don't look like what they expect me to look like. All right. So going back to kind of what causes this implicit bias. We covered the curriculum, but then there's also media. Media is a huge influencer of Native stereotypes. And so if everything that we learned in school and continue to learn, we perpetuate even as adults, leads to this belief that Native people don't exist or they're not significant enough, then it becomes really, really easy to then turn that race of people into something like a mascot. If you believe that that population is no longer relevant, doesn't exist, doesn't really have thoughts or feelings, then it's easy to turn it into a mascot. It's easy to dress up like an Indian for Halloween, really easy to throw on a headdress and go to a festival, right? Because we've been given these messages that that's okay because they don't exist. So I think this is a really good image for understanding the issues behind things like mascots. And I'm aware that some of the mascots now, there's been changes, but I still think it's important to realize that, you know, what has happened and led us to this point of having to change mascots. So when you look at this image, it says, can you imagine, right? Can you imagine a world where these were all mascots? But the irony here is that one of them actually is. So why is one of them okay, but the others are not? And same with this image as well. She's asking, well, which one is the mascot? And you shouldn't be able to answer that question, but unfortunately we can. One of them is or was a mascot. And mascots are basically meant to be ridiculed, right? There's Indian mascots, and then there's also animals. Indians and animals, those are mascots. And I think it's really important too to kind of cover the language that's used, not just the imagery. So again, I know that this has been changed, but I still think it's important to cover. So the word redskin, that's a racial slur. And it comes from a proclamation that was put out by the King of England in 1775 called the Phipps Proclamation. And it basically declared the Penobscot Indians of Massachusetts traitors to King George II. And he basically asked all of his subjects here to embrace all opportunities of pursuing, killing, and destroying all of the aforesaid Indians. And he was paying people money to bring to him or the colony alive Indian people or dead Indian people. And the way that you would prove if you killed an Indian is you would have their scalp. And so they called the scalp redskins. And so that is what makes it a racial slur, and that's where the term comes from. When I talk about this, I also like to point out the differences in how much they were paying for males and females, because it's pretty obvious here that a male was valued more than a female in this basically colonial proclamation. But in Native societies, females were actually valued more. Native societies are matriarchal, meaning, you know, it follows the mother. Women were the one who were in power, who were respected. But with the introduction of colonization, that kind of got flipped, and males are then valued more. So how can you avoid things like Halloween costumes, dressing up, questionable kids activities around Thanksgiving, mascots. Basically ask yourself, would this be appropriate for any other culture? Turn it around, would it be appropriate for me to dress up as a Korean for Halloween, right? Or would it be appropriate to have an African mascot? The answers to those are no, so the answer should also be no for Indigenous people. And so when these things like mascots and dressing up like an Indian and appropriating the culture becomes a norm in society, this contributes to historical trauma for Native people. And so I'll explain historical trauma. I think it's important to understand historical trauma when you want to form relationships with Native people, to understanding basically the history, what still happens, and how you can combat it. So that's why I'm going to cover historical trauma. So basically, historical trauma is the cumulative emotional and psychological wounding across the generations, including the lifespan, which emanates from massive group trauma. And the term was coined by Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart. She did research that was she looked at the DNA of Holocaust survivors and then looked at the DNA of Lakota people who are descendants of a massacre that happened at, it was called Wounded Knee Massacre, that happened in North Dakota, where many Lakota people were killed by the US military. And she found that there was the same genetic markers on DNA of Holocaust survivors as there were survivors and descendants of the Wounded Knee Massacre. So the trauma actually leaves marks on your DNA that can be passed down through the generations. And so what are causes of historical trauma? First, just European contact, colonization, stealing of land, genocide, cultural genocide, which is not being able to practice your culture. So whether it's not being able to speak your language, not being able to wear traditional clothes, believe what you believe, all of that was wiped away. Forced conversion to Christianity caused trauma. Boarding schools, desegregation, and this might be counterintuitive. So a lot of people think, well, desegregation happened 1960s, part of the civil rights movement, like great thing, right? We got to integrate. But for Native people, a lot of us were protected. When we had our own communities and were able to go to our own schools that we ran, we were thriving. But when we were forced into mainstream schools, a lot of our culture was taken away. We were victimized, victims of discrimination, racism, all of that. So there was another side of the coin to desegregation for Native people. Stealing children. This is actually still something that occurs today. Native women get their children taken from them either right when they're born, or CPS is called in and they deem that for some reason or another Native women shouldn't be raising their children with really no basis. Women are still sterilized today without permission from if they go seek care at IHS, the Indian Health Services. It still happens today. It's really mind-blowing. MMIW is missing and murdered Indigenous women. So Native women are disproportionately kidnapped and killed at a higher rate than any other race. So of course this causes trauma. There's even policies put into place that causes trauma. One example would be the recent change in policy for voters. I forget which state it was, but they changed it so that when you were on the reservation, you couldn't vote because you did not have an address that matched the policy.
It was North Dakota.
I'm sorry?
Sorry, it was North Dakota.
Oh, thank you. So then what are the results of historical trauma? So you have things like increased mental health issues, chronic health issues, substance use, violence, poverty, internalized oppression, high rates of suicide, fear of utilizing mainstream services. All right, so why did I present this information? And basically, what can you do with this information? First, I think it's super important to learn. that's the first step, right? You have to learn and break all these things down and understand the mechanisms of where we are today and what has led us to this place. Because without that, we can't really provide appropriate solutions, support, engagement, or relationships without first understanding those mechanisms. So, I mean, this is basically the first step, right? The second is understanding how to move forward and what are effective ways in building relationships. And part of that is having humility, right, in your relationships, and understanding that it's a continual learning process. It's a continual learning process for me, even though I'm from a Native community. There's so much diversity in Indigenous communities. I'm never going to learn everything. So I'm constantly learning about new cultures all the time, and new values and practices and beliefs. And before I jump into this information, I do want to make a disclaimer that because there's so much diversity within tribal communities, some of this might differ, right? So I might tell you, this is an Indigenous value generally, but when you go to partner with a specific tribe, that might not always be the case. So these are just more general Indigenous values, but it might vary tribe by tribe. So there are important Native cultural values that have kind of been summarized into what's called the 4 R's. And this is relationship. So the Native kinship obligation, we have an obligation to those that we're related to. Relationships are basically everything to Native communities, and they're super important. And so that's why I keep saying, building positive relationships with Native communities. That's your first step. Responsibility. We have a community obligation. I have an obligation to my community to give back to my community. And so any person or any organization that wants to form a relationship also has a responsibility to, do what they say they're going to do, or, give back to community, which flows into reciprocity, that responsibility to give back. There's a history of organizations or people coming into tribes and just taking, right? They want to do research, but then they don't give anything back to community, or they ask tribes to do all this, X, Y, and Z for them, and then don't give back. But part of that responsibility to Native communities is that reciprocal relationship. What are you offering Native community in return? And then redistribution, the sharing obligation. So those are 4 Indigenous values that are really important to Native cultures. It's also important just to note some differences in practice. So for a lot of Indigenous communities, we see things as more holistic. Everything is related. And I think I might talk about this in the next slide, but there's a relationship between like your physical health and emotional health, for example, and things are starting, like healthcare in this country is starting to move in that direction, to view things more holistically, but that's something that Native people have known for like hundreds of years, but people in the healthcare field are just now like catching on to this holistic view of things. We're very communal. Community is very important. Everything is circular. Everything comes back around. Like the last slide of how those values went in a circle. They were all related to each other. And then I really do like to focus on the positives and the strengths of Indigenous communities, because there is so much. I think it's really easy to focus on, well, how can we help these Native communities with all these issues they're experiencing, when I think there's a lot of value in supporting Native communities in their strengths. So, for example, we know here in North Carolina, we do have a disparity when it comes to diabetes and hypertension for Indigenous communities. But rather than focus on that, I like to see how can we support the Coheri tribe, for example, in economic development. They have a great river program. The Coheri River is really important to them. They lead kayak tours on their river. So how can we invest in that? Because once you invest in these assets, you're ultimately going to improve on the issues or the deficits. But then we have like corporate culture, or Western culture, has a more siloed view of things, more individualistic rather than communal. Time is more linear and it's more deficit based. So those can be some differences in culture. And then I think it's important, if you're going to form relationships with tribal community, to understand tribal sovereignty, which is, like I mentioned before, it's the inherent authority of tribes to govern themselves. And it's important to understand tribal sovereignty because that means there is probably going to be a really big difference in how they approach things. So a lot of my experience has been with research, so I'm going to use that as an example. So in universities have their own protocol for research. They have their own institutional review boards. You have to go through a certain process, but with a lot of tribes, tribal councils or tribal governments have to approve this research that you're requesting to do with a tribe. And this process for some tribes can literally take over a year. And my previous experience working in a university and with Native populations, people would get really frustrated because they would want to do research with the tribe, but not understand that there is differences in how the government operates. And so you have to go through over a year-long process in order for your research to be approved by the tribe. And it would cause a lot of frustration, but I think understanding those differences is really important, and understanding that they absolutely have a right to govern themselves and no other entity can really dictate how tribes do things. And I sent this document out for a pre-read, but I did just want to go through a few of these because these are really important for anybody who wants to be an ally to Native community or to form relationships with Native community. So first, do not act out of guilt. Act if you have a genuine interest in challenging the implicit biases or the stereotypes or anything that you have held before. Understand that you are always secondary to the Indigenous people that you're working with. So that includes me too, right? Even though I'm Indigenous from a Native community, I am always second to the Indigenous people that I'm serving, and my needs take a back seat. If you want to form effective relationships, their needs are going to come first. Be fully grounded in your own ancestral history and culture. Otherwise, the wannabe syndrome is going to undermine the Indigenous people's efforts. And so I do just want to talk about that for a second because I get this a lot. And I used SpongeBob memes to describe this whole document. I thought this was a really good one. But basically all the time I hear things like, my great grandma was Cherokee or a Cherokee princess. And I understand that this is a story that's passed down in a lot of families. So if this is a story that's been in your family, I am not trying to call out or belittle or anything like that. I just kind of want to educate on what this comment actually does to the Indigenous communities that you're trying to partner with. And this SpongeBob meme shows exactly that. Like, your relationship with that Indigenous person has just shut down. They've just closed down because this is not a helpful statement. And that's because the Indigenous people are the ones with the lived experience in their community and the lived experience as an Indigenous person. And the two aren't really comparable. So even if this story is true within your family, a lot of times it's best just to keep that to yourself when, at first, at least when working with Indigenous people. Otherwise, you're going to shut down that relationship pretty quickly. The next is being aware of your privileges and openly discuss them. And this will serve to challenge those larger oppressive structures that we talked about earlier, the things that form those implicit biases. So also, if you're working with Native populations and any movement or effort that you're bringing to Native community, you need to make sure that it's adequately serving the Native people. So most things are with good intentions, right? Even the researchers who want to do research in Native communities, it all has good intentions, but they might not serve those who need it the most. And they might not be priorities of that Native community. So doing kind of your homework and understanding what are the actual needs is going to serve you really well, because you can have the best intentions, but when you work to help Native people with their actual needs, that's when you get the best results. And then don't take up space and resources, physical or financial, of the oppressed group. And this is related to the last one, right? So if you come into Native community asking for their time and energy on a research topic that's not relevant to them and is not going to help them and is not going to provide that reciprocal relationship, you've just taken up too much time and space, and you've actually used up resources from a community that doesn't have that much to begin with. And we see that a lot. Accept the responsibility of learning and reading more about your role as effective allies, which is exactly what you're doing today by attending this presentation. So what are ways to go beyond land acknowledgement? So land acknowledgement, it's starting to become more of a popular thing to do, I guess you could say, is companies making this land statement before they have a conference or presentation or whatever it is. But I think it's really important to acknowledge that we do need to go beyond it. Making a statement is usually not enough. So first, learning about the tribes near you. Whose land are you on? Whose land was it? There's a really good website. I think it's called whoselandareyouon.com. You can literally go there and put in your address and it will show you historically what tribes were in that place. But then you also need to learn about what are the tribes currently living in the area that you are in and contributing to the overall culture of your county, your town, your state. And also learn about your own culture. I think that's really important. Back to the Ally Bill of Responsibilities, is you do have a responsibility to know about your own history and culture so that you don't fall into the wannabe syndrome. And you have to do the work to unlearn all of those stereotypes and those implicit biases that we talked about earlier. Listen to actual Native people. So the books that you read to learn about Indigenous people, make sure it's written by Indigenous people. The movies that you watch, make sure it's produced by Indigenous people. And act in ways that demonstrate humility and that you are open to continually learning, and demonstrate that you can be a good ally. So I think that is all I had, but I would really like to leave time for questions that anyone might have, because I know that is a lot and it can be heavy. So really any questions that you have, I am very open to them.
Thanks, Teryn. That was awesome. Yes, it was heavy. I learned so much. I think a lot of us fall in that category of having to learn this all over again because it wasn't taught the way it went down in schools and how we grew up. So it was awesome. And I loved how you wrapped it up with learning and unlearning. Doing a lot of diversity, equity, inclusion work. People just want that answer. Like, how can I build relationships? How can I make my team an inclusive environment? And it really takes learning about people's experiences to be able to do that. So thank you for sharing that. I know Tiffany dropped a question in the chat. Tiffany, did you want to ask that, or I can?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, Teryn, I know we've kind of had conversations about this in the past, but just examples of like common terms or trends that we're seeing that people, we may not recognize are actually like hurtful or stereotypical. I know you hit on some, but like, I know when we talked in the past, mentioning like spirit animal and things like that, that may not realize like where those tie back to. So I don't know if you want to share a couple of those.
Yeah, so I think a really good one that we probably see more than others is the headdress. And I know I alluded to that earlier. So like the headdress is a trend that we see like with festivals. It's printed on t-shirts from like Urban Outfitters and all that kind of stuff. But I think a really good comparison for the headdress is it's actually the same as someone awarded a Purple Heart in the military. Headdresses for Plains tribes are awarded to warriors who do something heroic similar to that of a Purple Heart. So you wouldn't just throw on a Purple Heart and wear it out in public. That would be completely inappropriate, but it's the same for a headdress. And so that's one of the things that make it really inappropriate. And then like things like spirit animal is a term that people throw around. Powwow, let's have a powwow instead of like, let's have a meeting. Those are all terms that it's worthwhile to rethink your use of that, because they do have stereotypical and racist origins.
And then too, Teryn, I know you talked about like allyship and what we can do better, but I know obviously this is going into like Thanksgiving. I know you had shared some things that you sent like to Zane's teacher, for example, of like alternate, you know, ways to celebrate. And I don't know if that's something maybe you want to share also, given kind of where, you know, right around the corner from it.
Yeah, exactly. So Thanksgiving, yeah, that's the months October to November are heavy with this kind of stuff, because you have, of course, the Columbus Day or Indigenous Peoples Day, then you have Halloween and the costumes, and then you have Thanksgiving. So Thanksgiving specifically is a holiday where we see a lot of kids in school doing the like dressing up as pilgrims and Indians and doing the plays, and they learn that the colonists provided all of this to the Indian people when it was actually like the other way around. And it again demonstrates that power dynamic that I talked about with Columbus. And even if you look at, and this is something I forgot to mention, if you look at imagery of the first Thanksgiving, even Columbus, you'll see a dynamic even in the pictures of who is towering above and who is pictured as submissive. And it's always the Indigenous people who are pictured as submissive, where the colonizer is above. And so recognizing those things in what you might be teaching and showing to your children, I think is really important. And values around Thanksgiving really differ from tribe to tribe. I know, like my family, we still celebrate Thanksgiving, but we focus on things to be thankful for, because Thanksgiving is a practice in Indigenous communities. We always give thanks before. It's the same thing as a prayer, basically, you know, before anything all year round. So that's kind of what we focus on. And I did see a really good article that came out in Indian Country today. There was a member of the Wampanoag tribe who retold the story of Thanksgiving. And so I can actually send that link once I find it, because I need to go back and watch it. I haven't watched it yet, but I think that would be a really good resource coming straight from the tribe that had that first contact and had that first Thanksgiving with the colonists, and hearing it from the Indigenous perspective, I think is really important. And as far as kids like dressing up for Thanksgiving, that is something that I would totally avoid. And it goes back to like the cultural appropriation thing. Like I wouldn't dress my child up in any other culture, because I don't find that appropriate. So just thinking about those things and asking yourselves those questions before you engage in any kind of craft or play or activity, I think is really important.
This is really helpful. Thank you, Teryn. Teryn, I just wanted to say I appreciate the content. This is very informative.
Oh, you're welcome. Yeah, you're welcome.
Yeah, thank you, Teryn. I agree with Stephanie. Really eye-opening, and the way I think you framed things up, put things into a very rational perspective, right? And so I guess as I'm thinking, education sounds like the absolute sort of first step. I guess, you know, any observations from you as to steps that, you know, from an educational standpoint, change is being affected, or
yeah,
that maybe this group might be able to take the reins on?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, and it's actually really relevant, because there's something happening right now within the North Carolina Department of Instruction where they're changing the history textbooks. And we actually have in DPI our own State Advisory Council on Indian Education that is supposed to be active in advocating for these things like changes in curriculum. But it is extremely difficult to change North Carolina curriculum standards. It goes back to policy, and it's a whole mess. But basically, they want to change the textbooks that are given in social studies and history classes to where they're basically taking out Indigenous populations and replacing it with information that's just not accurate. And it's really mind-blowing that they didn't even consult any of the tribes to do this in North Carolina. So there's really a sense of urgency right now with trying to stop this book. The people who are doing it said that they made contacts with the tribes, but nobody got emails at the tribes. So it's just, it's crazy, but extremely hard to change policy and to change the curriculum. And unfortunately, we're not making much headway, but hopefully it'll be something that can be changed soon.
Yep. Yeah, I can, yeah, having children and changing any policy can be challenging. Any, self-serving, are there things that folks can do on their own, whether it be, contacting local tribes for own educational purposes, right? Sort of taking that matter in their own hands. Any thoughts there?
Yeah, a lot of teachers and parents have been doing that too. I've come across many teachers who are starting to not follow the curriculum and to do other things that incorporates contemporary tribal communities and educating their students in positive ways. There's also a really good resource under the State Advisory Council for Indian Education if you do have kids, or if you want to send this to your children's teacher. It's alternative, culturally appropriate books, activities. I think there's even a section in there that breaks curriculum down even by subject and how you can incorporate Indigenous populations into curriculum that way. So even though policy is not really moving right now, there's individual efforts that I think are really helping.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Question I had, Teryn, when I think about kind of my earliest memories of learning anything about Indians, I think back to Pocahontas and Disney movies and kind of the fantasy of what that looked like. And then now as a 31-year-old, Yellowstone is all the rage, and there's a significant part of that plot line that focuses on the American Indian population. So I guess my question is, how have you seen more of the media side of things in terms of like TV and movies progress or go backwards in terms of what we should be seeing and hearing about our American Indian populations?
Yeah, great question. I think it is getting better, fortunately. I think, so for example, Pocahontas was on Netflix. I don't know if it still is, but they added like a disclaimer to the description of Pocahontas, which I think is great. And social media has really helped with that, like sharing things that, lots of people can see that it's like, hey, like actually Pocahontas was like 12 years old and she was raped and kidnapped. Like that is really helpful, just laying out the truth for people and having more people have access to that information. And then Yellowstone, there's a show called Reservation Dogs now that's really big, that is produced by Indigenous people and Indigenous actors. And so it's more Indigenous people being put at the forefront and taking ownership of that content rather than having it written about us and not incorporating actual Indigenous people. And there's several more examples of Indigenous actors being incorporated or tribes being consulted in the production of things. So I think things are getting better. Yeah.
I have a question, I guess more so from like a communication perspective, like as we share about Native American Heritage Month, from a corporate perspective, but also just from a personal perspective with friends and family, like what images are culturally appropriate to use, and like having a better understanding of the historical significance and current practices, like how do we best reflect this culturally?
Yeah, so one thing that I like to do is incorporate images from contemporary Native artists. And I completely forgot to mention this in my entire presentation, is I incorporated pictures of contemporary Native art into the slide. So I had a picture of pottery from a contemporary Halawasa Pony artist. I had basketry, beadwork, pinecone patchwork. So I like to use those images because they kind of, one, they break stereotypes, right? It's not just feathers and beads and buckskin that people are used to seeing. It shows the depth of the culture and the differences in each culture of each tribe. And it also gives a current Native artist a platform, right? You're showcasing their art, you have a little bio about them, you've consulted with them and using an image of their art. So that's what I like to do within my company. And then as far as like the resources that are shared, just making sure that it's vetted or coming from an Indigenous organization or people, I think is the most important thing. And I think November is a really common time to get questions of like, well, what can I do for Indigenous community during this time? And I think that's good, but it's also important to realize that a lot of Indigenous communities, especially here in North Carolina, we're a pretty, the capacity to do much more is not really there. And so when you're approaching Native community and asking for, you know, what can I do? What activities can I do? It sometimes is creating more work for the tribes to have to find you something to do, you know, to fulfill that need to contribute in the month of November. When some of our tribes don't even have full-time staff. We just do this in our volunteer time. We run our tribal governments in our volunteer time. So I think the most important step, and something that I've been emphasizing with my own company, is doing the work yourself, right? Like learning, unlearning, doing that work and providing people those resources of like, hey, here are the resources, just learn for yourself and then we can move forward. I think that's really important.
Yeah, thank you.
I hope that answered your question.
Yes, it did. Thank you.
And we're really lucky. Teryn actually has given us a ton of resources for recognizing this month that we were sharing internally. So thank you for all of those great resources, and more to come this month as well. Any additional questions? Right. Well, Teryn, thank you so much. I definitely have my two big takeaways, learn and unlearn. So I definitely appreciate your time. I know you're super busy all year long. So thank you for spending time with the select group. We will send out this recorded session along with a lot of the resources that Teryn referenced to everyone that attended. And I hope you all have a great day. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Teryn.
Thank you so much.